I'm Isabella Rodriguez, 42 years old, and despite everything I'd sacrificed for my family, I was never good enough for my father. The annual family reunion was approaching, and I dreaded it more than usual. Little did I know that in my purse was a letter that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. By the end of that night, I would finally understand why my father had spent my entire life trying to erase me. Before I share my story, let me know where you're watching from and hit that like button if you've ever felt invisible in your own family. Trust me, what happened next might give you the strength you've been looking for. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into Dad's circular driveway, my 12-year-old Honda looking like an apology next to the parade of luxury cars already there. Jessica's pearl white Tesla, Marcus's midnight black BMW. Even my cousin had managed to upgrade to something that didn't sound like it was dying. I gripped the steering wheel, watching my family move around the wraparound porch like actors in a play I'd never been cast in. The annual Whitmore family reunion. 3 days of fake smiles, cutting remarks disguised as concern, and the inevitable reminder that I ranked dead last in this family. "Mom, you're doing that face thing again," Emma said from the passenger seat, her 16-year-old voice cutting through my spiral. "What face thing?" "That face that says you'd rather get a root canal than walk in there." She was applying lip gloss but watching me in the visor mirror. "It's just Grandpa being Grandpa. You know that, right?" I wanted to tell her it wasn't that simple. That just Grandpa being Grandpa had been the soundtrack of my entire childhood. That even at 42, I still felt like that 17-year-old girl who could never do anything right. "You're right," I said instead, checking my reflection. The woman staring back looked exhausted, not just tired, but soul-deep drained from working 2 jobs and pretending everything was fine. "Let's go be a happy family." The screen door slammed behind us as we entered the chaos. The smell hit me immediately. Dad's cologne mixed with lemon furniture polish and the faint scent of lake water. It was the smell of my childhood, back when I still believed I could earn my place here. "Isabella!" Diane appeared from the kitchen with arms wide, embracing me like a mannequin would. She was 53 but looked 10 years younger, thanks to what she called good genes, and what I suspected was Dr. Patterson's plastic surgery skills. "You made it." We were starting to worry. "Traffic was heavy," I lied. Truth was, I'd sat in a parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to find the courage to come at all. "Well, you're here now." Her smile could have powered the house. "Everyone's on the deck. Your father's about to make his speech." Of course he was. Dad's speeches were legendary, not because they inspired anyone, but because they were mandatory. We all had to gather while he held court, dispensing wisdom and judgment like a king addressing peasants. I followed Diane through the house, Emma trailing behind, and stepped onto the deck where the Whitmore clan had assembled. The deck overlooked the lake, and the late afternoon sun cast everything in golden light that should have been beautiful but felt harsh instead. Dad stood at the head of the long table, crystal tumbler in hand, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the humidity. At 68, Robert Whitmore still commanded every room he entered. He'd built his accounting firm from nothing, had more money than God, and never let anyone forget either fact. "Ah, Isabella." His voice carried across the deck, stopping all conversations. "Nice of you to join us." There it was. Not even 5 minutes in, and I was already being reminded that I was late, inconveniencing everyone, the problem child who couldn't even show up on time. "Sorry, Dad," I said, hating how automatically the apology came. "Traffic was heavy, yes," Diane mentioned. He waved dismissively. "Well, now that we're all here, I wanted to say something." I found a chair next to my brother Marcus, who gave me a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Marcus was 45, 3 years older, and had inherited Dad's talent for making money and his complete inability to show genuine emotion. Jessica sat across from me, looking flawless as always in a dress that probably cost more than my rent. She was the baby at 39, a pediatric surgeon married to another surgeon, with 2 perfectly behaved children who sat like little robots. "This family," Dad began, raising his glass, "has always been about excellence, about making something of ourselves, about refusing to settle for mediocrity." My stomach clenched. Here we go. I look around this table and I see success. I see people who've taken the values I taught them and built meaningful lives. His gaze swept across Marcus, lingered on Jessica, then landed on me like a weight. I'm proud of all my children. The pause stretched like torture. I felt Emma tense beside me. Well, most of them. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Some of you understand what it means to be a Whitmore. Some of you know how to make something of yourselves. Another pause, his eyes locked on mine. And others, well, we don't usually discuss the losers at family gatherings, do we? The words hit like a physical blow. Around the table, I watched my family members suddenly find their napkins fascinating. Marcus studied his wine like it held the secrets of the universe. Jessica's perfect composure cracked just slightly. But it was Emma's sharp gasp that broke my heart. My beautiful, brilliant daughter who'd watched me work myself to the bone, who'd seen me cry over bills, who still believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Dad, Jessica said quietly, but he held up a hand. I'm not finished. He took a sip of whiskey, savoring both the liquor and the moment. I've worked my entire life to build something lasting, to create a legacy. And it's important we acknowledge who contributes to that legacy, and who. He shrugged like the rest wasn't worth saying. My face burned, but I couldn't move. It was like being 17 again, standing in his office while he explained why he wouldn't help pay for art school. Painting pictures isn't a career, Isabella. It's a hobby for people who can afford to fail. Robert, Diane said, but her tone was more amused than disapproving. What? Dad spread his hands innocently. I'm just being honest. That's what family is for, right? To tell you the truth when no one else will. Emma's chair scraped against the deck as she stood abruptly. I need to use the bathroom, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. I watched my daughter flee, and something inside me snapped. Not dramatically. More like a rope that had been fraying for years finally giving way. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady. Excuse me. Isabella, Marcus said quietly. Don't what? I turned to him. Don't leave? Don't embarrass the family? Don't act like the loser I apparently am. He's just had a few drinks, Jessica said, still not meeting my eyes. No, I said quietly. He's just being honest. That's what family is for, right? I walked toward the house, my footsteps echoing on the deck. Behind me, I could hear murmurs, someone trying to smooth things over. The party continuing like I'd never existed. Inside, I found Emma in the guest bathroom, splashing cold water on her face. She looked up when I entered, her eyes red and furious. Mom, how can you let him talk to you like that?
Emma, no, seriously.
How can you just sit there and take it? Grandma would be so angry if she could see this. She grabbed a towel, her movements sharp with frustration. She always said you were her favorite. She said you had the biggest heart of anyone she knew. I leaned against the door, suddenly exhausted. Your grandmother was kind. She saw the best in everyone. She saw the truth, Emma said fiercely. And the truth is you're worth 10 of any of them. You raised me alone after Dad left. You worked 2 jobs to keep us in our house. You took care of Grandma when she was dying, not them. Emmy, don't Emmy me. I'm not a kid anymore. I can see what's happening. She tossed the towel down. They treat you like garbage and you just take it. Why? I didn't have an answer. At least not when I was ready to say out loud. I need some air, I said instead. I slipped out the back door and walked down to the lake. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades Mom would have loved. She always said sunsets were God's way of showing us that even endings could be beautiful. The dock creaked as I sat down, letting my legs dangle over the edge. I could hear voices from the deck, laughter carrying on the evening air. The party was continuing without me, just like always. I was pulling out my phone to call an Uber when I heard footsteps above. Through the wooden slats I could see shadows moving around, voices drifting down. Can't believe he said that in front of everyone. You know how he gets when he's been drinking. Still, that was harsh even for him. Jessica's voice. For a moment I felt hope. Maybe she would stand up for me. Maybe. Did you tell her about the new will? Diane's voice made me freeze. No, Marcus now. Dad said he'd handle it after the reunion. Good. The less she knows, the better. At least until everything's finalized. My heart started racing. She's going to find out eventually, Jessica said. By then it won't matter, Diane replied. Robert signed everything over yesterday. The house, the accounts, everything. She has no idea what's coming. The voices moved away, but I stayed frozen on the dock, my mind spinning. What had he signed? What was coming? And why was I the only one who didn't know? I looked back at the house, Mom's house, where I'd spent every summer, where I'd held her hand during her final weeks, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. Whatever they were planning, I was about to discover just how far outside this family I really was. The water lapped gently against the dock, and in the distance, I could hear Dad's voice, loud and jovial, telling another story about his success. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't listening. I was thinking about what Mom would have said about daughters who let themselves be treated like losers, and what she would have done if she'd been here to see it. The sun disappeared behind the trees, and darkness began to fall. But instead of going back, I stayed on the dock, staring at the water and wondering what other secrets this family had been keeping from me. Something told me I was about to find out. I stayed on that dock until the party sounds faded and house lights began flickering on across the water. When I finally walked back up, I found Emma in the kitchen making herself a sandwich, pointedly ignoring the elaborate spread Diane had catered. There you are, she said without looking up. I was starting to think you'd decided to swim across the lake. Tempting, I admitted, grabbing a glass. But then who would drive you home? She shot me a sideways look. We don't have to stay the whole weekend. We could leave tomorrow morning. The suggestion was appealing, but something held me back. Maybe it was what I'd overheard, or maybe it was 30 years of unfinished business finally demanding resolution. Let's see how tomorrow goes. Mom. Emma's voice was quieter now. What Grandpa said tonight. You know that's not true, right? I set down my water and really looked at my daughter. When had she gotten so tall? So serious? 16 and already more emotionally intelligent than most of the adults in this house. Sometimes people say cruel things when they want to feel powerful, I said carefully. That's not an answer. No, it's not. I sat across from her. The truth is, Emmy, I've been trying to figure out my place in this family my entire life. Maybe that's the problem. She bit into her sandwich, considering this. Grandma never made you feel that way. No, she didn't. The memory was bittersweet. Your grandmother was different. Different was putting it mildly. While Dad built his empire of expectations and judgments, Mom had created quiet spaces of acceptance. She'd hung my terrible finger paintings on the refrigerator, sat through every school play, told me success wasn't always measured in dollar signs. Tell me about when you took care of her, Emma said. Really tell me. Not the nice version. I looked at my daughter, this young woman asking for truth instead of protection, and made a choice. It was 2 years of watching the strongest woman I knew become smaller every day. Uncle Marcus visited maybe 6 times. Aunt Jessica came for long weekends when convenient. But I was there every single day. The memories flooded back. Moving into my childhood bedroom at 38. Feeling like a failure because my marriage had ended and my art career never took off. Driving Mom to chemo, holding her head while she vomited, learning to manage medications and oxygen tanks. I gave up my apartment in the city. Gave up the gallery job I'd finally gotten. Gave up any chance of rebuilding my life because she needed me. And Dad resented you for it. I looked up, surprised by Emma's insight. How did you? Because he couldn't stand that she needed you more than him. Because you were the one she asked for when she was scared, not him. She was right. In those final months when Mom's world shrank to her bedroom, I was the one she reached for. Not Dad with his awkward cheerfulness, not Marcus with his stilted phone calls, not Jessica with her medical expertise that couldn't actually help. He never forgave me for being her favorite, I said quietly. Is that why he married Diane so fast? I winced. The wedding had been 8 months after Mom's funeral. A courthouse ceremony none of us kids were invited to. I found out from a neighbor who saw it in the paper. He was lonely. Diane made things easier. She made you disappear, Emma said bluntly. That was closer to the truth. Within 6 months of the wedding, I'd been effectively erased. Holidays became optional. Family photos no longer included me unless I was holding someone's baby. My presence wasn't expected, my absence wasn't mourned. Why didn't Uncle Marcus or Aunt Jessica stand up for you? The question I've been asking myself for years. Because it was easier not to. Because standing up to your grandfather has never been safe. And because I trailed off, not sure how to explain the dynamics that had governed our family for decades. Because they were always the golden children, Emma finished. That's not fair to them. Isn't it? Emma pushed her plate away. Mom, I've been watching this family my whole life. Uncle Marcus got to be the heir because he's a boy and went into business. Aunt Jessica got to be the perfect daughter because she became a doctor and married well. But you? You chose Art. You chose to follow your heart instead of his plan. And he's been punishing you ever since. Her words hit uncomfortably close to home. The golden child dynamics had been established early. Marcus, the firstborn son, heir to the empire. Jessica, the baby, brilliant and beautiful and everything Dad wanted. And me, caught in the middle, never quite measuring up. It's more complicated than that, I said weakly. Is it? Emma stood, rinsing her plate. Because from where I'm sitting it looks simple. He wanted you to be someone you're not. And when you refused, he decided to pretend you don't exist. Before I could respond, voices echoed in the hallway. Jessica appeared in the doorway, looking flustered. Oh good, you're still up. She glanced around like checking for spies. Can I talk to you? Alone. Emma took the hint, kissing my cheek. I'll be upstairs if you need me. Jessica waited until Emma's footsteps faded. Isabella, about tonight. What Dad said was completely out of line. Was it? Or was it just honest? Don't do that. Don't pretend you deserved it. Jessica sat across from me, and for a moment she looked like the little sister I'd grown up with instead of the polished surgeon she'd become. He was drunk and showing off for Diane's family. I'd forgotten Diane's sister was visiting. An audience made Dad's cruelty worse. He performed his disappointment like entertainment. Jessica, what new will? The color drained from her face. What? I heard you talking on the deck. About Dad signing something yesterday about a new will. What's happening that I don't know about? Jessica looked away, fidgeting with her wedding ring. Isabella, I can't. It's not my place. Whose place is it? I interrupted. Everyone knows but me. Marcus knows. Diane knows. Even her sister probably knows. So whose place is it to tell me my father is cutting me out of whatever's left of this family? He's not cutting you out, Jessica said quickly, unconvincingly. Then what? Long silence. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with something that might have been regret. He's putting everything in trust. The business, investments, this house. Marcus and I are trustees. You'll still benefit, but you won't control anything. The words hit like ice water. He's declaring me incompetent. That's not how he put it. How did he put it? Jessica winced. He said he wanted to protect the family legacy from poor decision-making. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Poor decision-making. Like art school. Like getting divorced. Like caring more about Mom than money. Isabella? No, it's perfect actually. I stood surprised by how calm I felt. He's finally made it official. I'm not really a Whitmore after all. That's not true. Isn't it? I looked at my sister. This woman who'd let our father humiliate me publicly. Who'd known about his plans and said nothing. When's the last time you called me, Jessica? When's the last time you asked how Emma was doing? Or if I needed help? Or if I was okay? She didn't answer because we both knew the truth. Our relationship, like everything else in this family, had been reduced to obligatory appearances at mandatory events. I used to think we were close, I continued. When we were kids, I thought you looked up to me. I thought I was protecting you. You were, she said quietly. You always stood between me and Dad when he was in his moods. You took the heat so I didn't have to. And now, Now I have children of my own to protect. A marriage. A career that could be affected if Dad decides to. She stopped, realizing what she'd admitted. If Dad decides to what? Punish you for associating with the family loser. That's not what I meant. Yes, it is. I felt that strange calm spreading through me. It's exactly what you meant. You're all so terrified of losing his approval that you'll sacrifice me to keep it. Isabella, please. I'm trying to. To what? Warn me? Help me? Or just make yourself feel better? She didn't answer and I realized I didn't need her to. I'm going to bed, I said. Thank you for telling me about the will. At least now I know where I stand. Isabella, wait. Jessica's voice stopped me at the doorway. There's something else. About Mom. I turned back, something in her tone making my skin prickle. What about her? Before she died, she asked me to give you something. I've been holding on to it, waiting for the right time. What kind of something? Jessica reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, cream-colored and yellowed with age. My name was written across it in Mom's distinctive handwriting. She made me promise to give this to you when you needed it most. Jessica held out the envelope, her hand trembling. I think that time might be now. I took the envelope, feeling its weight. It was sealed, and there was something more than paper inside, something small and hard. How long have you been carrying this? 3 years, Jessica admitted. Since the funeral. She gave it to me the night before she died, when you'd gone home to shower. She said you'd know what to do with it when the time was right. 3 years. 3 years of feeling lost, of wondering what Mom would think about my choices, of desperately wanting her guidance. And Jessica had been carrying her final words to me like a secret. Why now? I asked. Because I saw your face tonight, when Dad called you a loser. And I remembered what Mom said when she gave me this. What did she say? Jessica's eyes filled with tears. She said, My Isabella has the strongest heart of all of us. But she's going to need to remember that when they try to break it. I held the envelope against my chest, feeling something shift inside me. Not the sharp crack of breaking, but the deep rumble of something awakening. I should have given it to you sooner, Jessica whispered. I'm sorry. I looked at my sister, this woman who'd held on to our mother's final gift for 3 years, who'd watched our father systematically erase me, who'd chosen her own security over sisterly loyalty again and again. Yeah, I said quietly. You should have. I left her in the kitchen and went upstairs to my old bedroom, clutching Mom's letter like a lifeline. Behind the closed door, I sat on the bed I'd slept in as a child and stared at my name in my mother's handwriting. Emma was right. Grandma would be furious if she could see what had become of her family. But maybe, just maybe, she'd left me the tools to do something about it. My fingers traced the envelope's edges, feeling that small hard object inside. Whatever Mom had wanted me to have, whatever she'd thought I'd need when the time was right, I was about to discover. And something told me that after tonight, nothing in the Whitmore family would ever be the same. I sat on my childhood bed for nearly an hour, holding Mom's letter like it might explode. The weight felt enormous. Not just paper and whatever was tucked inside, but 3 years of questions that might finally have answers. The room hadn't changed much since I'd moved out 15 years ago. Same pale blue walls, same white furniture, same view of the lake through windows Dad never bothered updating. It was like a museum of who I used to be, hopeful, naive, still believing love and effort could earn me a place in this family. Voices drifted up from downstairs, the evening's festivities winding down. Diane's laugh carried through the floorboards, bright and fake. Dad's voice boomed occasionally, probably telling his stories about building his empire from nothing. The same stories he told my entire life. Always with the message that if he could make something of himself, anyone could. Anyone who wasn't weak. Anyone who wasn't a loser. I turned the envelope over, studying Mom's careful handwriting. Even toward the end, when the medication made her hands shake, her writing had remained elegant. She'd been a teacher before marrying Dad, back when women's careers were expected to be temporary. Finally, I slid my finger under the seal. 2 things fell into my lap. Folded stationery covered in Mom's writing, and a small brass key tied with red ribbon. My heart started racing as I unfolded the letter. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, the kind Mom used for special occasions. The handwriting was shakier than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. My dearest Isabella, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and your father has probably already begun pushing you away. I've watched him do it your entire life, not because he doesn't love you, but because you remind him too much of what he used to be before ambition hardened his heart. I need you to tell you the truth about so many things, sweetheart. Truth I should have shared while I was alive, but I was too frightened. I thought staying quiet would protect you, but I see now I was only protecting myself. First, about this house. Your father acts like everything we have came from his work, but that's not entirely true. This lake house belonged to my family for 3 generations. My grandmother, Margaret, left it to me specifically because she said I understood that a home should shelter love, not ego. She made me promise to pass it on to the daughter who understood the same thing. That daughter is you, Isabella. It was always you. My hands started trembling, the words blurring through sudden tears. Your father never knew about the separate will I had drawn up 5 years ago. He believes everything automatically becomes his when I die, but that's not how inheritance law works with specific family properties. The lake house, along with the land it sits on, was mine to give, and I'm giving it to you. I had to stop reading, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. The lake house was mine? This house where Dad had just humiliated me, where he'd made his speech about losers, where he'd signed some mysterious will because he didn't trust me with family assets. But that's not all, sweetheart. Over the years, I've been setting aside money from my own inheritance, bonds and investments your father never knew about. Nothing enormous, I'm not talking millions, but enough to give you choices. Enough to ensure you never have to depend on anyone else's approval to survive. I've also been keeping records. Documentation of every time your father has made financial decisions that prioritized his ego over his family's well-being. Every time he's used money as a weapon to control people who should matter most. I thought someday you might need proof that his version of events isn't the only truth. My hand shook so badly I could barely hold the paper steady. The key in this envelope opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown. Box number 347. Inside, you'll find copies of the Real will, the documentation I mentioned, and access information for accounts I've set up in your name. I've also included something else, letters I've written to Emma over the years, for when she's older and ready to understand the truth about her grandmother's side of the family. Isabella, you are not the failure your father has tried to make you believe. You are not weak for choosing love over money, for staying to care for me when your siblings couldn't be bothered, for raising Emma with kindness instead of criticism. You are not a loser for following your heart instead of his blueprint. You are the daughter who inherited my mother's strength and my grandmother's wisdom. You are the daughter who knows that family legacy isn't measured in dollar signs, but in the love we leave behind. The people in this house tonight, the ones who will sit silently while your father attacks you, who will protect their own interests while watching yours be destroyed, they are not your real family. Your real family is Emma, and any other souls you choose to include in your circle of love. But if you decide you want to fight for what's rightfully yours, if you want to show them exactly what kind of woman you really are, then everything you need is in that safety deposit box. The choice is yours, sweetheart. It was always yours. With all my love and faith in who you are, Mom. P.S. The key to the safety deposit box isn't the only key in the house. There's a loose brick behind the old fireplace in the basement. 3rd row from the bottom, 4th brick from the left. Your great-grandmother Margaret was a woman who believed in keeping her most important treasures hidden from men who thought they owned everything they could see. You might be surprised what you find there. I sat in stunned silence, the letter clutched in my hands, trying to process what I'd just read. The lake house was mine. Had been mine for 3 years, according to legal documents I'd never known existed. The money I'd been worrying about, Emma's college tuition that kept me awake at night, the constant stress of living paycheck to paycheck. Mom had tried to solve all of it. And Jessica had been carrying this letter for 3 years. 3 years of watching me struggle, watching me doubt myself, watching me accept Dad's version of who I was and what I was worth. 3 years of family gatherings where I felt like an outsider in a house that was legally mine. A sound from downstairs made me freeze, Footsteps in the hallway, someone walking with purpose. I quickly folded the letter and slipped it, along with the key, into my overnight bag. Whatever was happening, whoever was moving around downstairs, I needed time to think before I acted on anything Mom had revealed. But even as I tried to process the magnitude of what I'd learned, one thought kept circling. Mom had known. She'd known exactly what would happen after she died, had known Dad would try to erase me, had known I'd need proof of my own worth when everyone else forgot it. She'd known, and she'd prepared for it. I slipped out of my room and crept down the hallway toward the stairs, moving as quietly as possible. The footsteps I'd heard seemed to be coming from the basement, unusual, since there was nothing down there but Dad's old workshop and storage rooms. At the top of the basement stairs, I paused, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but I could hear someone moving things around, the scrape of metal against stone. Someone else was looking for something hidden in the basement. Someone else knew about the loose brick behind the fireplace. I crept down the stairs, grateful Mom had always kept the hinges oiled. The basement was dark except for a single flashlight beam moving around near the old stone fireplace. In the dim light, I could make out a figure crouched behind the hearth, pulling at something in the wall. It was Diane. My stepmother was wearing rubber gloves and had a small crowbar, working methodically at the mortar around the bricks. A cardboard box sat beside her, already partially filled with papers and small objects. I watched as she found the brick Mom had described, third row from the bottom, fourth from the left. Came loose easily like it had been removed recently. Diane reached into the cavity and pulled out a metal box about the size of a shoebox. "Finally," she muttered, her voice echoing slightly. Stupid woman and her hiding places. She opened the box, and even from where I stood, I could see papers, what looked like more keys, and several small jewelry boxes. Diane began transferring everything to her cardboard box, working quickly and efficiently. I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to breathe normally. How did Diane know about Mom's hiding place? How long had she been searching for whatever was in that box? And more importantly, what else did she know about Mom's secrets? As I watched, Diane replaced the brick and began cleaning up any evidence of her search. She was methodical, careful, like she'd done this before. Like she'd been planning this. She stood up, brushing dust off her clothes, and picked up her box of stolen treasures. As she turned toward the stairs, her flashlight beam swept across the basement, and I pressed myself against the wall, praying she wouldn't see me. The light passed over me and kept moving. Diane walked past the stairs, heading toward the back exit that led outside. She was leaving through the basement door, probably to avoid being seen by anyone still awake upstairs. I waited until I heard the door close and her footsteps fade before moving. My mind was racing. Whatever Diane had just stolen from Mom's hiding place, it was connected to the letter I'd just read. Mom had mentioned that Margaret believed in keeping treasures hidden from men who thought they owned everything. But apparently, she'd also needed to hide them from women who married those men. I pulled out my phone and used its flashlight to examine the fireplace. The brick was back in place, but I could see fresh mortar dust on the floor. Whatever Diane had found, she'd been looking for it specifically. This wasn't a random search. But Mom's letter had mentioned the safety deposit box at the bank. Whatever Diane had just stolen, the most important documents were still safely locked away where she couldn't get to them. At least I hoped they were. I crept back upstairs, my mind spinning with questions and possibilities. In the space of one evening, I'd gone from being the family disappointment to potentially being the rightful owner of the house where my father had just humiliated me. From worrying about college tuition to discovering Mom had left me enough money to give Emma choices. From feeling like an outsider to realizing I might be the only legitimate heir to what really mattered. But I'd also discovered that Diane knew about Mom's secrets, had been actively searching for them, and was willing to steal to get what she wanted. Which meant whatever was happening with Dad's new will, whatever legal maneuvering was taking place to cut me out of the family assets, it wasn't just about his disappointment in me. It was about covering up the truth. I slipped back into my room and locked the door. Outside, I could hear a car starting. Probably Diane returning from wherever she'd taken her stolen box. In a few minutes, she'd be back in the house, playing the grieving stepmother who only wanted what was best for the family. But I knew better now. I pulled Mom's letter out of my bag and read it again, this time focusing on every detail. The safety deposit box, the bank downtown, the records she'd kept of Dad's financial decisions. Tomorrow was Saturday. The bank would be open in the morning. And for the first time in 3 years, I had somewhere to go that might finally give me the answers I'd been looking for. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into my bag, along with the brass key that might unlock everything. Then I lay down on my childhood bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Somewhere in this building, my father was probably sleeping soundly, confident that his latest humiliation had put me back in my place. Somewhere else, Diane was hiding whatever she'd stolen from Mom's secret cache, probably planning her next move in whatever game she'd been playing since the day she married into this family. But they didn't know what I knew now. They didn't know that the woman they dismissed as weak and naive had actually been the strongest person in the house. And they definitely didn't know that she'd left me everything I needed to prove it. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but my mind kept returning to one line from Mom's letter. If you decide you want to fight for what's rightfully yours, if you want to show them exactly what kind of woman you really are, then everything you need is in that safety deposit box. The choice was mine, she'd said. And for the first time in 3 years, I knew exactly what choice I was going to make. I woke at 6 a.m., my body apparently deciding sleep was less important than the electricity coursing through my veins. The house was still quiet. Dad had never been an early riser, and Diane certainly wasn't going to break that pattern. I had maybe 2 hours before anyone else stirred. Perfect. I dressed quickly in jeans and a sweater, then slipped downstairs and out the back door. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of lake water and pine trees. It would have been peaceful if my heart wasn't hammering like a drum. The drive to town took 20 minutes, and First National Bank opened at 8. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before they unlocked the doors, clutching the brass key and trying to prepare myself for whatever I was about to discover. The safety deposit box area was in the basement, all polished marble and hushed voices. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, led me through the security procedures with professional efficiency. Box 347, she said, inserting her key alongside mine. I remember your mother. Lovely woman. She came in regularly over the years. Regularly? Oh yes, maybe every 6 months or so. Always very particular about keeping everything organized. The clerk turned both keys and pulled out a long metal box. I'll give you some privacy. Alone in the small viewing room, I lifted the lid and felt my breath catch. Mom hadn't been exaggerating. The box was meticulously organized, with labeled folders and envelopes arranged in perfect order. On top was a manila envelope marked Read First, in her careful handwriting. Inside that envelope was another letter, this one typed on her old typewriter, along with several legal documents. Isabella, if you're reading this, then you've found your way here. Which means you're ready to know the whole truth. I've organized everything in this box to tell a story. The story of what really happened to our family's money, and why your father has spent so many years making you feel like you don't deserve any of it. Folder number 1 contains the real will. The one that supersedes anything your father might have signed recently. The lake house and surrounding property have been in my family for 3 generations. Your father never had any legal right to dispose of them, no matter what he might have told anyone. Folder number 2 contains documentation of your father's business practices over the past 15 years. Not illegal exactly, but unethical. He's been systematically overcharging clients, particularly elderly ones who don't understand tax law complexity. He's also been claiming deductions for business entertainment that were actually personal vacations. Folder number 3 is what I call my insurance policy. Your father has been having an affair for the past 6 years. I have photographs, credit card statements, hotel receipts. Her name is Monica Reeves. She's 34, works at his office, and he's been paying her rent on a downtown apartment. I never confronted him about Monica because I was dying, and frankly I didn't have the energy for that particular battle. But I documented everything because I knew someday someone might need leverage. Folder number 4 contains the financial records for accounts I've set up in your name. There's $180,000 in bonds and CDs, plus another $65,000 in savings. It's not enough to retire on, but it's enough to give you and Emma independence. Folder number 5 is for Emma, letters I've written to her over the years, plus some jewelry that belonged to my mother and grandmother. When she's ready, these will help her understand where her strength comes from. Isabella, you have choices now. You can use this information to reclaim what's rightfully yours, or you can walk away and build a new life with the resources I've left you. Either way, you'll never again have to accept being treated as less than you are. But if you choose to fight, remember, your father's greatest weakness is his pride. He cannot bear to look foolish or weak, especially in front of other people. Use that. All my love, Mom. P.S. There's one more thing. Check the bottom of the box. I set the letter aside with shaking hands and opened the first folder. The will was exactly as Mom had described. Legal documents that clearly established my ownership of the lake house and surrounding property. The deed was in my name, had been for 3 years, and Dad had never had any legal authority to include it in any trust or estate planning. Folder number 2 made my stomach turn. Mom had been thorough in documenting Dad's questionable business practices. Client files, billing records, receipts that showed a pattern of overcharging and unnecessary services. Nothing that would send him to prison, but enough to destroy his reputation and probably result in significant penalties. Folder number 3 was even worse. Monica Reeves was young, blonde, and had been enjoying a very comfortable lifestyle courtesy of my father's guilty conscience. The photos weren't explicit, but they were damning. Dad and Monica at restaurants, coming out of hotels, her apartment building with Dad's car parked outside. The financial records in folder number 4 brought tears to my eyes. Mom had been careful, patient, setting aside small amounts over years and investing them wisely. She'd built a nest egg that would give Emma a college education without debt, and give me the freedom to finally pursue my art without worrying about rent. But it was what I found at the bottom of the box that made me laugh out loud. A sound that echoed strangely in the small room. A small digital recorder with a note attached. Your father likes to confess his sins when he's drinking. I started recording our conversations after his first mention of Monica. Track 7 is particularly interesting. I plugged in the earbuds Mom had thoughtfully included and scrolled to track 7. Her voice came through clearly, asking gentle questions about Dad's day, his work, his stress levels. And then his voice slurred with whiskey and self-pity. Isabella thinks she's so goddamn pure, taking care of you like some kind of saint. But she doesn't know about Monica, does she? Doesn't know that while she's playing nurse, I'm getting what I need from someone who actually appreciates me. Robert, you shouldn't. Shouldn't what? Have a little happiness? I've earned it, Margaret. Built this whole empire from nothing, and what do I get? A sick wife, an ungrateful daughter, and a son who only calls when he needs money. Isabella loves you. Isabella judges me, just like you do. But Monica makes me feel like a man again. And when you're gone, I'm going to make sure she's taken care of. The will, the trust, it's all arranged so Isabella can't interfere. Mom's voice was very quiet when she responded. And what about Emma? Emma will be fine. She's a smart girl. Not like her mother. I yanked out the earbuds, my hands shaking with rage. He'd been planning this for years. The systematic exclusion from family decisions, the public humiliations, the new will that put everything in trust. It wasn't about protecting the family legacy from my poor decision-making. It was about protecting his affair from exposure. I spent another hour going through everything, photographing documents with my phone, making sure I understood the full scope of what Mom had left me. By the time I returned the box to its slot and left the bank, I had a complete picture of my father's secret life and a clear plan for what to do about it. But first I needed to deal with Diane. I drove back to the lake house and found her in the kitchen, making coffee and looking perfectly innocent in a silk robe and matching slippers. She looked up when I entered, her smile bright and false. Isabella, you're up early. I hope the reunion isn't wearing you out. Not at all, I said, setting my purse on the counter. Actually, I'm feeling more energized than I have in years. Something in my tone made her pause, coffee mug halfway to her lips. Oh, I had an interesting conversation with my mother last night. Diane's laugh was carefully modulated. Sweetheart, your mother has been gone for 3 years. I know, but she left me a letter. Several letters, actually. I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I'd taken at the bank, along with some very interesting documentation. The color drained from Diane's face. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? I swiped to a photo of the property deed. This is the deed to the lake house, Diane. The one that's been in my name for 3 years. The one that proves my father never had any legal right to include this property in his trust arrangements. Her coffee mug hit the counter with a sharp crack. You see, my mother was much smarter than any of us gave her credit for. She knew exactly what would happen after she died, and she prepared for it. I swiped to another photo. She also knew about Monica Reeves. Diane's mask finally slipped completely. You little bitch. There she is, I said mildly. I was wondering when the real Diane would show up. You think you're so clever, don't you? Finding some old paperwork and thinking it changes anything. Her voice was vicious now, all pretense gone. Your father signed everything over to the trust yesterday. Whatever your dead mother thought she was doing, it doesn't matter now. Actually, it does. Because you can't put property in trust when you don't own it. And my father doesn't own this house. I smiled at her, feeling a power I'd never experienced before. I do. That's impossible. Is it? Tell me, Diane, what exactly were you looking for in the basement last night? Her eyes widened. I don't know what. I saw you. Around midnight, with your little crowbar and rubber gloves, stealing whatever my great-grandmother Margaret left hidden behind that loose brick. I leaned against the counter, enjoying the way she was backing away from me. What I'm curious about is how you knew to look there. I didn't. My mother's letter mentioned several hiding places. She was very thorough about documenting her family's history of keeping treasures away from men who thought they owned everything. I paused, letting that sink in. And apparently women who married those men. Diane's face was white with rage. You can't prove anything. Can't I? I pulled up another photo on my phone. This is a picture of my father with Monica Reeves, coming out of the Fairmont Hotel 6 months ago. My mother took it from the parking garage across the street. Robert will never believe that his wife of 3 years has been documenting his affair, that she found out about the apartment downtown, the credit card bills, the business dinners that were actually dates. I scrolled through more photos. My mother was dying, Diane, but she wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what kind of woman you were. What do you want? The question came out as a hiss. I want you to tell me what you took from the basement. I want you to tell me how long you've been searching through my mother's things. And I want you to tell me what other schemes you and my father have been cooking up to make sure I never find out the truth about this family. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating, trying to figure out how much I actually knew versus how much I was guessing. The thing is, Diane, I don't actually need you to tell me anything. I have everything I need already. I put my phone away and poured myself coffee from the pot she'd made. But I'm curious about something. Did you marry my father because you loved him, or because you thought he was rich? Both, she said finally. And when you found out that the real money, the real property, belonged to my mother's family? I did what I had to do. You started planning to get rid of me. She didn't deny it, which was answer enough. Here's what's going to happen, I said, sitting down at the kitchen island. You're going to go upstairs and pack your things. You're going to tell my father that you need to visit your sister for a few days. And you're going to stay away from this house until I decide what to do with the information I have. You can't throw me out of my own home. It's not your home. It never was. I took a sip of coffee, surprised by how calm I felt. And if you try to take anything else that belonged to my mother or her family, I'll have you arrested for theft. Robert will. Robert will what? Choose you over his children? Destroy his reputation to protect your feelings. I laughed. My father's greatest love affair is with himself, Diane. When he finds out you've been stealing from his dead wife's family, when he realizes your schemes could expose his affair and ruin his business, he'll throw you away like yesterday's garbage. She knew I was right. I could see it in her eyes. This isn't over, she said finally. Yes, it is. I stood up, suddenly feeling taller than I had in years. The only question now is whether you leave quietly or whether I share my mother's files with everyone at tomorrow's brunch. Diane stared at me for another long moment, then turned and stalked out of the kitchen. I could hear her footsteps on the stairs, sharp and angry. 15 minutes later, she was back with a suitcase, dressed and perfectly made up despite the early hour. She paused at the kitchen doorway. "You think you've won something," she said. "But you have no idea what you're dealing with. Your father will destroy you before he lets you take what he thinks is his." "Maybe," I said. "But this time I'll be ready for him." After she left, I sat alone in the kitchen of my house, and thought about what came next. Dad would be awake soon, probably wondering where his wife had gone. The rest of the family would arrive for Saturday's activities, expecting another day of business as usual. But business as usual was over. I was still sitting there when Emma came downstairs, drawn by the smell of coffee. "Mom? You're up early. And why do you look like you just won the lottery?" I smiled at my daughter, this remarkable young woman who'd inherited her grandmother's wisdom and her great-grandmother's strength. "Because," I said, "I think I just did." 6 months later, the morning light streamed through the tall windows of what used to be the Whitmore family lake house and was now simply home. I stood in what had once been Dad's formal dining room, watching Emma arrange easels for the afternoon's art therapy session, and marveled at how completely everything had changed. The confrontation with Dad had been swift and brutal. When he'd woken that Saturday morning to find Diane gone and me sitting calmly at his kitchen table with Mom's files spread out like evidence, his face had cycled through confusion, rage, denial, and finally, for the first time in my life, genuine fear. "You can't possibly think anyone will believe this nonsense," he'd said, but his voice lacked its usual commanding authority. "They don't have to believe it," I'd replied, sliding the property deed across the table. "The law doesn't care what people believe. It cares what people can prove." The legal battle had lasted exactly 3 weeks. Dad's lawyers had tried every angle they could think of, but Mom's documentation was flawless. The lake house and its surrounding 20 acres had been legally mine since her death. Dad's trust arrangements were null and void regarding property he'd never actually owned. But it wasn't the legal victory that had changed everything. It was what happened next. Marcus and Jessica had chosen sides exactly as I'd expected. Marcus sided with Dad, convinced that family loyalty meant protecting the patriarch regardless of his actions. Jessica had surprised me by quietly reaching out 2 weeks after the dust settled, apologizing not just for holding on to Mom's letter for 3 years, but for a lifetime of choosing the easy path over the right one. "I keep thinking about what Mom would say," she told me during a tearful phone call, "about the women we became instead of the women she raised us to be." "It's not too late to be different," I'd said, and meant it. Dad had moved in with Marcus temporarily, his relationship with Diane ending as abruptly as it had begun once she realized the money wasn't there. Monica Reeves had disappeared from his life the moment his business came under scrutiny for the billing irregularities Mom had documented. Apparently, a 68-year-old man with financial problems wasn't quite as appealing as a successful businessman with deep pockets. The art therapy center had been Emma's idea, actually. "Mom, you have this huge house, you're trained in counseling, and you're an artist. Why don't you help other people the way you wish someone had helped you?" Out of the mouths of teenagers. We'd started small. Just a few women who'd responded to a notice I'd posted at the community center. Women going through divorces. Women dealing with difficult family dynamics. Women who felt invisible, unheard, diminished by people who were supposed to love them. Within 3 months we had a waiting list. "Mrs. Patterson is here for her individual session," Emma called from the main room, where she'd set up a reception area that managed to feel both professional and welcoming. Mrs. Patterson was 72, recently widowed, and dealing with adult children who'd swooped in after her husband's funeral to help her manage her finances. By help, they meant take control of everything while treating her like she was already senile. "Her daughter-in-law called again," Emma added quietly as I passed, "asking when the session ends and whether Mrs. Patterson really needs to be here so often." I shook my head. Some patterns never changed. "What did you tell her?" "That Mrs. Patterson is an adult who makes her own appointments. Good girl. My individual sessions were held in what used to be Dad's home office, the room where he'd called me in for lectures about my life choices, where he'd made it clear my dreams weren't valuable enough to support. Now it was a space filled with natural light, comfortable seating, and canvases where people could express emotions they'd never been allowed to speak. Mrs. Patterson was working on a painting of her garden, not the perfect magazine-worthy garden her daughter-in-law wanted her to maintain, but the wild, slightly overgrown garden she'd always loved. Tomatoes climbing handmade trellises, flowers planted wherever they wanted to grow, vegetables and herbs mixed together in joyful chaos. My husband always said I had no sense of organization, she said, adding another splash of yellow to a patch of marigolds. But this garden fed our family for 40 years. Tell me about that, I said, settling into the chair beside her easel. For the next hour, Mrs. Patterson painted and talked about the life she'd built, not the sanitized version her children preferred, but the real one. The struggles and victories, the choices she'd made and the prices she'd paid. The garden became a metaphor for everything she'd cultivated over decades of marriage and motherhood. I used to think I needed their approval, she said as we cleaned brushes at the end of the session. My children. I thought if I was agreeable enough, quiet enough, they'd remember I'm still their mother. And now I think maybe it's time for them to remember that I raised them, not the other way around. After Mrs. Patterson left, I had 20 minutes before the group session started. I used the time to check on Emma, who was finishing homework at the reception desk while fielding phone calls from potential new clients. At 16, she'd become my unofficial assistant manager, handling scheduling and intake calls with a professionalism that amazed me. More importantly, she'd become confident in a way I'd never been at her age, sure of her own worth, unafraid to speak up when something wasn't right. Mom, she said, hanging up from a call, that was the woman from the domestic violence shelter. She wants to know if you can do a workshop next month for women who are rebuilding their lives after leaving abusive relationships. What did you tell her? That you'd call her back, but that you've never turned down a chance to help people find their voices. She was right. Over the past 6 months, I'd spoken at women's groups, divorce recovery workshops, and family therapy conferences. The center had caught the attention of local media when a prominent businesswoman's wife wrote an op-ed about her experience here, describing how art therapy had helped her reclaim her identity after 30 years of being just someone's wife. The article had brought more clients than we could handle, along with funding offers from organizations that supported women's empowerment initiatives. The center was not only sustainable, it was thriving. There's something else, Emma said, her voice more serious. Aunt Jessica called. She wants to know if she can come visit next weekend. Jessica had been slowly rebuilding our relationship, making tentative overtures that I'd been cautiously accepting. She'd left her surgical practice temporarily to deal with her own family crisis. Her husband had turned out to be having an affair of his own, and she was going through a divorce that had forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about the life she'd built. She's bringing the kids, Emma continued. She said she wants them to see what you've built here. She wants them to understand what their grandmother would have thought of this place. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. Not anxiety this time, but something deeper. Hope maybe. Or healing. Tell her yes, I said. Tell her they're welcome here. The afternoon group session was my favorite part of each week. 8 women, ranging in age from 35 to 68, all dealing with different forms of family trauma, but united by their determination to reclaim their own stories. There was Linda, whose adult son had cut off contact when she refused to loan him money for his 3rd failed business venture. Maria, whose husband had left her for a younger woman after 25 years of marriage, taking most of their assets and leaving her to rebuild at 50. Patricia, whose in-laws had spent decades undermining her parenting until her children stopped respecting her entirely. And Nancy, whose story was so similar to mine that the first time she spoke, I'd had to excuse myself to cry in the bathroom. My mother-in-law used to introduce me as the woman who married my son, Nancy was saying as she worked on a canvas covered in bold strokes of red and orange. Never by my name. Never as her daughter-in-law. Just the woman who married my son. Like I was some kind of unfortunate accident. How did that make you feel? Asked Maria, who was working on a sculpture made from broken pieces of pottery, fragments she was reassembling into something new and stronger. Invisible, Nancy said immediately. Like I didn't exist except in relation to him. Like I had no identity of my own. And now? Linda prompted. She was sketching what looked like a doorway, solid and permanent. Nancy smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in months of sessions. Now I know that woman is gone. The woman who needed their approval, who shrunk herself to fit their expectations. She doesn't exist anymore. What happened to her? Patricia asked gently. I buried her, Nancy said, adding a streak of gold to her painting. Right next to the version of my ex-husband that I thought I'd married. And I planted a garden on top of both graves. The group fell into comfortable silence. 8 women painting and sculpting their way back to themselves. 8 women who'd been told they were too much or not enough, who'd been diminished and dismissed by people who were supposed to love them. 8 women who were learning that their stories didn't end with other people's definitions of who they should be. After the session ended and everyone had gone home, Emma and I sat on the back porch overlooking the lake, watching the sun set over water that had witnessed 4 generations of women learning to be strong. Mom, Emma said, her feet tucked under her in the old wicker chair. Do you ever miss the way things used to be? It was a question she'd asked before in different ways, and I'd learned to take it seriously. At 16, she was old enough to understand that our new life had come at a cost. Dad barely spoke to us now. The extended family gatherings had stopped entirely. Marcus treated us like we were traitors to some 'cause they'd never bothered to explain. I missed the idea of having a big, loving family, I said honestly. I missed the fantasy I had about who those people could be. But I don't miss feeling small. Do you think they'll ever understand what you've built here? I looked at the house behind us, the rooms that now held easels and art supplies instead of Dad's trophies and awards. The space that buzzed with women's voices instead of echoing with criticism and judgment. The home that had become a sanctuary instead of a battlefield. I don't think they're capable of understanding it, I said. And I'm okay with that now. Because you don't need their approval anymore. Because I finally figured out where approval should come from. Emma nodded, her teenage wisdom sometimes astounding me. From yourself. And from the people whose opinions actually matter. And from you, I added, reaching over to squeeze her hand. My approval of myself went up about 1,000% when I realized I'd raised a daughter who knows her own worth. She grinned at me, this remarkable young woman who'd inherited the best of 4 generations of strong women. I learned from the best. As darkness fell over the lake, we could see lights coming on in houses across the water. Other families, other stories, other women probably fighting their own battles for recognition and respect. Tomorrow some of them might find their way to our door. They might join our Tuesday group or sign up for individual sessions or simply call to ask if it was really possible to rebuild your life at 45 or 55 or 65. And I would tell them what I'd learned, that some flowers really do bloom best when they're transplanted to better soil. That sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. And that the woman you become when you stop trying to be who everyone else wants you to be is usually the woman you were meant to be all along. The phone rang inside the house. Probably another potential client, or maybe Jessica calling to confirm next weekend's visit. Emma jumped up to answer it, and I stayed on the porch for a few more minutes, listening to the sound of my daughter's confident voice welcoming someone new into our world. 6 months ago, I'd been the family loser, sitting at this same lake while my father called me a failure in front of everyone who was supposed to love me. Tonight, I was a woman who'd built something meaningful from the ashes of that humiliation. A woman who helped other women find their voices. A woman who'd raised a daughter who would never doubt her own worth. A woman who'd finally learned the difference between being loved and being seen. And that, I thought as I headed inside to see who needed our help, made all the difference in the world. 1 year later, the knock on my door came on a Tuesday morning in October, during that brief window between my individual sessions and group therapy. I was in the kitchen making tea for Mrs. Chan, whose son-in-law had just announced he was taking over her finances for her own good. When I heard the familiar click of heels across the front porch, Through the window, I could see a figure standing uncertainly at my door. Someone tall and elegantly dressed, shifting their weight like they weren't sure they should be there. It was Jessica. I hadn't seen my sister in person since the brief, awkward visit she'd made 8 months ago with her children. That weekend had been careful and stilted, both of us dancing around years of hurt feelings and missed opportunities. She'd seemed genuinely impressed by what I'd built at the center, but there had been a distance between us that felt unbridgeable. Like we were speaking different languages after living in different worlds for so long. Now she was back, and something about her posture told me this wasn't a social call. I opened the door to find Jessica looking nothing like the polished surgeon I'd grown up with. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her face was makeup-free and puffy from crying, and she was wearing jeans and a rumpled sweater that looked like she'd slept in them. "Isabella," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm sorry to just show up like this. I should have called, but Come in," I said, stepping aside. "You look like you need that tea more than Mrs. Chon does." She followed me into the kitchen, glancing around at the changes I'd made over the past year. The formal dining room was now visible through the archway, set up for the afternoon's group session with easels arranged in a circle and morning light streaming through windows I'd had enlarged. "This place feels so different," she said, accepting the mug of chamomile tea I handed her. "Like it's actually alive now." "It is." I sat across from her at the kitchen island, studying her face. Jessica had always been beautiful in that effortless way. Good bones, clear skin, natural elegance that photographed well. But today she looked exhausted and fragile, like someone who'd been running on empty for too long. "How are the kids?" I asked, giving her time to settle. "They're with David this week." Her laugh was bitter. "Sorry, with Dr. David Morrison, as he prefers to be called now. Apparently, using his full title helps his new girlfriend understand how important he is." The divorce proceedings hadn't been going well. "I saw the article about you in Healthcare Weekly," I said carefully. "About taking a sabbatical from surgery." "A sabbatical?" Jessica set down her mug with a sharp click. "That's the polite way of saying I had a complete breakdown in the middle of a pediatric cardiac procedure, and had to have my attending take over." I felt my breath catch. "Jess, it's fine. The patient was fine. I was the problem." She stared into her tea like it might contain answers. 40 years old, and I finally realized I have no idea who I am when I'm not performing for someone else's approval. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with recognition. How many times had I felt exactly the same way? "What happened?" I asked gently. "David happened. The divorce happened. Dad happened." She looked up at me, and I could see decades of carefully suppressed pain swimming in her eyes. "Do you know what Dad said when I told him about David's affair?" I braced myself. "He said, 'Well, Jessica, you have to ask yourself what you did to drive him away. Successful men don't stray unless they're not getting what they need at home.'" Her voice was flat, emotionless. "And when I told him I was taking time off work to deal with the divorce and focus on the kids, he said I was being typically dramatic, and that I should be grateful David was only asking for joint custody instead of trying to prove I was an unfit mother." The familiar rage started building in my chest. The same fury I'd felt a year ago when Dad had called me a loser in front of the entire family. But this time it wasn't directed at Jessica. It was for her. "And then," she continued, "when I finally got up the courage to ask if I could move back home temporarily while I figured things out, he said the house wasn't big enough for another emotional woman, and suggested I get therapy to work on my tendency toward self-pity. Jesus, Jace. The kicker? When I was driving away from his house, crying in my car like a teenager, I realized something. She looked directly at me for the first time since she'd arrived. I realized that he'd never spoken to you any differently than he was speaking to me, and that I'd spent my entire adult life watching him tear you down, and telling myself you deserved it, because it kept me safe. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock, the same clock that had been there when we were children, marking time through decades of family dysfunction. "I enabled him," Jessica said quietly. "I watched him humiliate you at every family gathering, watched him dismiss your dreams and mock your choices, And I never said a word because I was terrified of losing his approval. Jess. No, let me finish. I need to say this. She was crying now, quiet tears she didn't bother to wipe away. You sacrificed everything to take care of Mom. You gave up your apartment, your job, your entire life to be there for her when she was dying. And instead of being grateful, instead of recognizing that you were doing what the rest of us were too selfish or scared to do, Dad punished you for it. I wanted to reach across the table and take her hand, but something held me back. This felt like a confession that had been building for years, and Jessica needed to get it all out. And I let him do it, she continued. Because it was easier to believe you were the problem than to admit that our father is a narcissist who can't stand anyone in the family being stronger or better than he is. The word hit the air like a thunderclap. Narcissist. In all the years of therapy sessions I'd attended, all the self-help books I'd read trying to understand why I never felt good enough, I'd never quite allowed myself to use that clinical term for Dad. But hearing Jessica say it felt like puzzle pieces clicking into place. When did you figure that out? I asked. Therapy, she said with a rueful smile. Turns out when your marriage implodes and your career falls apart, and your father calls you dramatic for having feelings about it, you finally get desperate enough to ask for professional help. And what did you learn? That I married David because he reminded me of Dad. Successful, demanding, never quite satisfied with anything I did. That I chose surgery not because I loved it, but because I knew it would impress Dad. That I've spent 40 years performing the role of the perfect daughter, while slowly suffocating inside. She paused, looking around the kitchen again. And that my sister, the one I wrote off as the family disappointment, was actually the only one brave enough to be herself. I felt tears starting in my own eyes. I wasn't brave, Jess. I was just bad at pretending to be someone else. Same thing, isn't it? Maybe it was. Maybe what I'd always seen as my weakness, my inability to mold myself into what Dad wanted, had actually been a form of strength I'd never recognized. Why are you here? I asked gently. Because I need help, she said simply. Because I'm 40 years old and I don't know how to rebuild a life when you've never actually built one in the first place. Because you did it, you walked away from his approval and created something meaningful, and I want to learn how. And because, she smiled through her tears. And because I miss my sister. I miss the person who used to stand between me and Dad's bad moods when we were kids. I miss the person who taught me how to braid my hair, and helped me with homework, and made me laugh when everything felt too serious. I miss her too, I admitted. Can I stay for a few days? I know you have your center in your life and probably don't need your mess of a sister showing up uninvited. Jessica. I reached across the table and took her hand, finally closing the distance between us. This is what families do. Real families. They show up for each other. She squeezed my fingers and for a moment, we were just two middle-aged women who'd survived the same childhood and were finally ready to talk about it honestly. I want to help, she said. With the center, I mean. I know I don't know anything about art therapy, but I'm a doctor. I understand trauma. And I think maybe I need to be around women who are rebuilding their lives. Because you're rebuilding yours. Because I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not performing for someone else's approval. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw something I'd never noticed before. Underneath the exhaustion and pain, there was something new. A determination that reminded me of Mom. A strength that looked suspiciously like the kind great-grandmother Margaret must have had when she decided to hide her treasures from men who thought they owned everything. The group session starts in an hour, I said. Want to observe? Can I? You're my sister. And this is your house too, legally speaking. Mom left it to the daughter who understood love over money, but she had 3 daughters. Jessica's eyes widened. Isabella, I can't. You're not taking anything from me, I said firmly. But you're welcome to share in what I've built here. If you want to. What about Dad? What about Marcus? They'll be furious if you what? Start thinking for yourself? Start making choices based on your own values instead of their expectations. I stood up and refilled both our mugs. Jess, they're already furious. Dad's been trying to control and manipulate all of us our entire lives. The only difference is that now you can see it. She was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. Tell me about the center, she said finally. Tell me what you've built here. For the next hour I walked Jessica through the house, showing her the art therapy rooms, the group meeting spaces, the quiet corners where women could process their emotions without judgment. I told her about Mrs. Patterson and her rebellious garden, about Nancy and her phoenix painting, about the dozens of women who'd found their voices within these walls. It's like you've created an anti-dad space, Jessica said as we finished the tour. A place where women are encouraged to be themselves instead of punished for it. I never thought of it that way, but yes, that's exactly what this is. And you did this all by yourself. Not by myself. Emma helped. The women who come here helped. Mom helped even though she's gone. I paused. And you could help too if you want to. I don't know the first thing about art therapy. But you know about healing. You know about trauma. And you know what it feels like to lose yourself in someone else's expectations. She nodded slowly. I could learn. You could. But more importantly, you could just be present. Sometimes that's all people need. Someone who sees them and doesn't judge them. Is that what you needed? All those years when Dad was tearing you down? Yes, I said simply. I needed someone to see me and say, you're enough exactly as you are. I'm sorry I never said that. You're saying it now. The sound of cars in the driveway interrupted us, the afternoon group arriving for their session. Jessica tensed slightly, suddenly nervous about being around strangers in this vulnerable state. You don't have to participate, I said quickly. You can just observe. Or you can go upstairs and rest. Whatever feels right. I want to stay, she said. I want to see what this looks like. Okay. But Jess, these women have been through hell. Some of them are dealing with abuse, others with family rejection, others with the aftermath of divorce or death or betrayal. If any of it feels too familiar, too painful, you can leave any time. I understand. And if you want to participate, if you want to share your story, that's okay too. But only if it feels safe. She nodded and I could see her gathering herself, putting on the professional mask she'd worn for so many years. But then she stopped, took a deep breath and let it fall away. Isabella. Yeah. Thank you. For letting me come back. For not giving up on us. I hugged my sister for the first time in years, feeling decades of resentment and hurt dissolving between us. Welcome home, Jess. As the women began filing into the house, chatting and laughing with the easy familiarity of people who'd found their tribe, I realized something profound had shifted. Not just between Jessica and me, but in the entire foundation of what family meant. For 42 years, I'd been trying to earn my place in a family that would never truly accept me. Today I discovered that the family I'd been looking for had been there all along. It just wasn't the one I'd been born into. It was the one I'd chosen to create. 2 years after the reunion, the auditorium at the Riverside Conference Center held 300 people. And every seat was filled. I stood behind the heavy curtain at the side of the stage, listening to my introduction being read aloud, and marveled at how surreal this moment felt. Dr. Isabella Rodriguezchen has been featured in Psychology Today, Women's Health, and the Journal of Expressive Arts Therapy for her groundbreaking work with family trauma survivors. Her book, Transplanted: Growing Strong in New Soil, has become a bestseller in the self-help category, and her Chun Center for Women's Renewal has served over 200 women in the past 18 months. Dr. Isabella Rodriguezchen. I'd gone back to school, earned my doctorate in art therapy, and legally changed my name to include Mom's maiden name. The hyphenation felt like a bridge between who I'd been and who I was becoming, honoring both my mother's legacy and my own journey. Today she'll be speaking on breaking generational patterns, when love means letting go. The applause started as I walked onto the stage, and I was struck by the sea of faces looking back at me. Mostly women, ranging from their 30s to their 70s, all here because something about my story had resonated with their own experiences of family rejection, emotional erasure, and the long journey back to self-worth. But what caught my attention wasn't the size of the crowd or the warm reception. It was the figure sitting in the back row, slightly apart from the rest of the audience. Dad. He looked older than his 70 years, his silver hair thinner, his face more lined. He was wearing one of his expensive suits, but it hung differently on him now, like he'd lost weight, or maybe just lost the commanding presence that had always made him seem larger than life. Next to him sat a woman I didn't recognize, probably a caregiver. Our eyes met for a brief moment across the auditorium, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Not the anger or disappointment I'd grown up with, not the dismissive contempt he'd shown at the family reunion 2 years ago. Something softer. Something that might have been confusion or regret, or simply the recognition that the daughter he'd called a loser was now standing on a stage being introduced as a doctor and best-selling author. I forced myself to look away and focus on the speech I'd prepared. How many of you, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system, have been told by someone who was supposed to love you that you're not enough? Not smart enough, not successful enough, not grateful enough, not whatever enough. A forest of hands went up. How many of you have spent years, maybe decades, trying to earn approval from people who were never going to give it to you? More hands. And how many of you have discovered that the family you were born into wasn't necessarily the family you needed? This time the applause was spontaneous and sustained. I could see women wiping away tears, nodding in recognition, leaning forward in their seats. My name is Isabella, and I was 42 years old when my father stood up at a family gathering and called me a loser in front of everyone who was supposed to love me. I let that sink in for a moment. But that wasn't the beginning of my story. That was the end of a story I'd been living my entire life. The story of a woman who believed she had to shrink herself to fit other people's expectations. I told them about the reunion, about the years of caregiving that went unacknowledged, about the systematic erosion of my self-worth at the hands of people who claimed to want what was best for me. I told them about finding Mom's letter, about discovering my own strength, about the choice to walk away from dysfunction disguised as family loyalty. The hardest part, I said, wasn't leaving. It was staying gone. Because there's something seductive about familiar pain. There's comfort in playing the same role you've always played, even when that role is destroying you. I could see heads nodding throughout the audience. But here's what I learned. Some flowers really do bloom best when they're transplanted to better soil. Some of us have to leave the garden we were planted in to discover what we're truly capable of growing into. I talked about the center, about the women who'd found their voices in the rooms where I'd once felt voiceless. I talked about Emma, about raising a daughter who would never doubt her own worth. I talked about Jessica, who was now the co-director of our program and had become the sister I'd always hoped she could be. Generational patterns, I said, are not genetic destiny. They're learned behaviors, and what can be learned can be unlearned. What can be inherited can also be consciously changed. 30 minutes into the speech, I noticed movement in the back row. Dad was shifting in his seat, and the woman beside him was leaning over to speak quietly in his ear. For a moment I thought he was leaving, walking out on this speech the same way he'd walked out on me emotionally years ago. But he wasn't leaving. He was listening. The question isn't whether your family of origin was perfect, I continued. The question is whether you're willing to break the patterns that don't serve you and create something better for the next generation. I wrapped up the speech with the words that had become something of a signature for me. You are not responsible for the family you were born into, but you are responsible for the family you choose to create. Whether that's with partners, friends, children, or simply the relationship you build with yourself. You are not a supporting character in someone else's story. You are the author of your own life. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. As people began filing out of the auditorium, I noticed that Dad remained in his seat, apparently waiting for the crowd to thin. My heart started beating faster. In the 2 years since the confrontation at the lake house, we'd had no contact. He'd made a few attempts to reach out through Marcus, and once through Jessica, but I'd made it clear that I wasn't interested in reconciliation unless he was prepared to acknowledge the damage he'd caused and commit to real change. Apparently that day had never come. Until now. I finished talking with the conference organizers and signing books for attendees, all while keeping one eye on the back of the auditorium. Dad waited patiently, his companion reading a magazine while he stared at his hands. Finally, when the last attendee had left and the venue staff were beginning to clean up, I walked down the aisle toward him. "Dad." He looked up and I was startled by how much he'd aged. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, seemed clouded and uncertain. "Isabella." His voice was quieter than I remembered. "Thank you for letting me stay. I didn't know you were coming. I bought a ticket like everyone else." He gestured to the woman beside him. "This is Margaret, she helps me get around these days." "Mr. Whitmore has early-stage dementia," Margaret said gently. "Some days are better than others, but today is a good day." He was very insistent about being here. Early-stage dementia. That explained the confusion I'd seen in his eyes, the way he seemed less substantial than the larger-than-life figure who dominated my childhood. "Why?" I asked. "Why did you want to be here?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to find the words. "I came to hear you speak," he said finally. "I came to see what you made of yourself." And another long pause. "You're not a loser." The words hung in the air between us. Not an apology exactly, but an admission. A recognition. "No," I said quietly. "I'm not. I was wrong." The admission seemed to cost him something. "About you. About a lot of things." "Yes, you were. Your mother would be proud." The comment caught me off guard. In all the years since Mom's death, Dad had rarely mentioned her except in the context of his own grief or the inconvenience of her absence. "She is proud," I corrected. "She left me everything I needed to become this person. The question is whether you can be proud of who I am now, instead of disappointed in who I never was." He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing this. The daughter he'd dismissed standing before him as an accomplished professional, the loser who'd built something meaningful from the ashes of his rejection. "I don't understand what happened," he said. "Between us. How it got so broken." "Yes." I sat down in the seat across the aisle from him, suddenly feeling exhausted. "It got broken because you couldn't love me for who I was. You could only love the version of me that existed in your imagination. The one who would follow your plan, make your choices, become successful in ways that reflected well on you. I wanted you to be happy."
No, Dad.
"You wanted me to be what you thought happiness looked like. There's a difference." He was quiet again, staring at his hands. "The woman who spoke today," he said finally. "The doctor, the author, the one helping other people, is that who you always were?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "That's who I always was. You just couldn't see it because it didn't match your blueprint." "And Emma is remarkable. She's confident and kind and brilliant. And she knows exactly who she is because I made sure she grew up in a house where those qualities were celebrated instead of criticized." "She doesn't know me." "No, she doesn't. Because you made it clear there wasn't room in your life for the family I actually am." We sat in silence for several minutes, the empty auditorium echoing around us. Finally, Dad looked up at me again. "I'm proud of you," he said, the words coming out rusty and unfamiliar. "I don't understand what you do or why you do it, but I'm proud of you." I felt tears starting in my eyes, but they weren't tears of joy or relief. They were tears of grief for the relationship we could have had, for the father he could have been, for the decades of connection we'd lost to his inability to see past his own expectations. "Thank you," I said. "That means something." "Does it mean enough?" The question was loaded with hope and desperation, and I realized he was asking whether this admission could somehow bridge the gap between us, whether we could find our way back to being father and daughter after everything that had happened. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know if there's enough trust left to rebuild on. But there might be." I looked at this man who'd shaped so much of my early life, who'd caused so much pain while believing he was providing guidance. The dementia would only get worse, Margaret had implied. He was running out of time to become the father he'd never been. But I was no longer running out of time to become the daughter I'd always been. "There might be," I said carefully. "But it would have to be different this time. I'm not going back to being the person who needs your approval to feel worthy." "I understand." "Do you?" Because this woman, the one who spoke today, the one who wrote the book, the one who helps other people find their strength, this is who I am now. Not the woman you wanted me to be. Not the daughter who was grateful for any scraps of affection you threw my way. This version of me, this version of you, he said slowly, is pretty impressive. It wasn't a complete transformation. It wasn't the tearful reconciliation that happened in movies, where decades of dysfunction dissolved in a single moment of understanding. But it was something. It was a beginning. I have to go, I said, standing up. I have a book signing at the hotel, and then Emma and I are driving back home tonight. Home. The lake house. Mom's house. My house now. He nodded, something that might have been acceptance crossing his face. Isabella. Yes. If I wanted to see it. What you've built there. Would that be possible? I studied his face, looking for the manipulation I'd learned to expect, the hidden agenda that usually came with his requests. But all I saw was an old man who was finally curious about the daughter he'd never bothered to know. Maybe, I said, when you're ready to see it without trying to change it. I think I'm ready now. We'll see. I walked back up the aisle toward the stage, where my purse and jacket were waiting. Behind me, I could hear Margaret helping Dad to his feet, their quiet conversation about getting to the car and whether he needed his medication. At the stage, I turned back for one last look. He was standing in the aisle, leaning slightly on Margaret's arm, watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. He looked proud, and maybe for the first time in my life he was seeing me clearly. But more importantly, I was seeing myself clearly. Not as the daughter who'd failed to meet his expectations, not as the woman who'd spent decades trying to earn love that should have been freely given. I was seeing myself as the woman who'd built something beautiful from the wreckage of family dysfunction. The woman who'd helped hundreds of other women find their voices. The woman who'd raised a daughter who would never doubt her own worth. The woman who'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. As I gathered my things and headed toward the book signing that would keep me busy for another 2 hours, I realized that the story that had begun with my father calling me a loser at a family reunion was finally complete. Not because he'd apologized or changed or become the father I'd always wanted, but because I'd finally become the woman I was always meant to be. And that, I thought as I signed books for women who were still fighting to find their own voices, was worth more than any family approval I'd ever longed for. The real victory wasn't in his recognition. It was in no longer needing it. Dad visited the center once, on a good day when his mind was clear and his memories intact. He sat quietly in the back of a group session, watching 8 women paint their way through trauma and transformation. Afterward, he asked me to show him the room that used to be his office. "It's better this way," he said, looking at the easels and art supplies where his desk and awards used to be. "Your mother would have liked this better." He never came back, but he sent a check every month, not to me but directly to the center's operating fund. The note that came with the first donation was simple: for the women who need a place to grow. Emma got into Stanford with a full scholarship and plans to study psychology. "I want to understand how families work," she told me. "The good ones and the broken ones and everything in between." Jessica and I opened a second location in the city, and she completed her training as an art therapist. She still struggles sometimes with the urge to seek approval from people who won't give it, but she's learning to catch herself before falling back into old patterns. Marcus and I have an awkward but functional relationship now. We see each other at holidays, the new kind of holidays we celebrate at the center, where chosen family gathers around tables that welcome everyone exactly as they are. And Dad? He declined quickly after that conference, the dementia stealing more memories each month. But sometimes, in his clearer moments, he would ask Margaret to read him articles about the center, about the women we were helping, about the work his daughter was doing. Margaret told me that once near the end he said, "I had 3 children and I only really knew 2 of them. The third one, she was the strongest of all, and I never saw it." He died on a Tuesday morning in spring, quietly and without drama. The funeral was small: Marcus and his family, Jessica and her kids, Emma and me. We buried him next to Mom in the family plot, under a headstone that listed his achievements and the dates of his life but said nothing about the father he'd been or the damage he'd caused. At the graveside, Jessica asked if I was okay. "I'm sad," I said, watching them lower the casket into the ground. "Not because I lost him years ago, but because he lost so much by refusing to see who I really was." "His loss," Emma said fiercely, taking my hand. "Yes," I agreed. "It was." We drove back to the lake house afterward, to the center that now bore Mom's name and served women from 3 counties. In the main room, a new group was gathering, women of all ages, all backgrounds, all with stories of families that had failed them in the long journey back to themselves. I watched them arrange their easels in the circle we'd painted on the floor, this chosen family of healing hearts, and realized that the story that had started with rejection and humiliation had become something I'd never expected. It had become a love story after all. Not the kind of love I'd spent decades trying to earn, but the kind of love that grows when you plant yourself in soil that wants you to flourish. The kind of love that multiplies when you share it. The kind of love that becomes a legacy. And that legacy, built not from money or property or family name, but from the simple radical act of helping other women remember their worth, would outlast any inheritance Dad could have left me. Because some flowers really do bloom best when they're transplanted to better soil. And some families are worth more than the ones you're born into. They're the ones you choose to grow. Have you ever discovered that your true family isn't always defined by blood? Sometimes the people who should love us unconditionally are the ones who hurt us most deeply. I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below about how you've created your own chosen family, or stood up to those who couldn't see your worth. If my story resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to hear more journeys of healing, and share with someone who might need to be reminded that their value doesn't depend on anyone else's validation. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes taking back your power means walking away from people who never deserved it in the first place.